Chapter 3 of The Copper Princess. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush, April 2009. The Copper Princess by Kirk Munroe. Chapter 3. A Varsity Stroke Strikes Adverse Fortune. Richard Peveril, student at Christ Church, was not only one of the most popular men in his college, but, as Stroke of the Varsity 8, was becoming one of the best known of Oxford undergraduates, when the blow was struck that compelled him to leave England and return to the land of his birth, without even waiting to try for his degree. He had been an orphan from early boyhood, and under the nominal care of a guardian who saw as little of his charge as possible, had passed most of his time in American boarding schools, until sent abroad to finish his education. While his guardian had never been unkind to him, he had not tried to understand the boy or to win his affection, but had placed him in the best schools, supplied him liberally with pocket money, and then let him alone. Although the lad had thus been denied the softening influence of a home, the tender care of a mother, and a father's counsel, his school life had trained him to self-reliance, prompt obedience to lawful authority, a strict sense of honor, and to a physical condition so perfect that in all his life he had never known a day's sickness. Having always had plenty of money, he had never learned its value, though in his school days his allowance had been limited by the same wise rules that also checked undue extravagance. Thus, while brought up to live and spend money like a gentleman, he had not been permitted to acquire vicious habits. Even at college his allowance had always been in excess of his needs, and so, though ever ready to help a friend in trouble, he had never run into debt on his own account. Another influence for good was the lad's inherited love for all out-of-door sports, and he could not remember the time when he was not in training for a team, a crew, or an athletic event of some kind. Thus the keeping of regular hours, together with a studied temperance in both eating and drinking, had been grafted into his very nature. Life had thus been made very pleasant for our hero, and, believing himself to be heir to a fortune, he had never been disturbed by anxieties concerning the future. Of course, while he had hosts of acquaintances, most of whom called themselves his friends, he was well aware that some of them were envious of his position, and would rejoice at his downfall, should such an event ever take place. It was partly this knowledge, partly his own sense of absolute security in life, and partly a habit acquired during a long career of leadership among his school companions, that rendered him brusque with those for whom he did not particularly care, and contemptuous to the verge of rudeness towards such persons as he disliked. Thus it will be seen that our young man possessed a faculty for the making of enemies as well as friends. Of his secret enemies the most bitter was a fellow student, also an American, named Owen, who, possessed of barely means enough to carry him through college, and with no prospects, had, by relinquishing everything else, taken such the same stand in scholarship that Peveril had in athletics. As a consequence, each was envious of the other, for the Stroke of the Varsity 8 was so little of a student that he had never more than barely scraped through with an examination in his life, and was always overwhelmed with conditions. This jealousy would not, however, have led to enmity without a further cause, which had been furnished within a year. Owen had crossed on a steamer with Mrs. Maturin Bonnifay of New York, and her only daughter Rose. They did London together, and never had the young American found that smoke-begrimed city so delightful. At his solicitation the Bonnifays consented to visit Oxford, and permitted him to act as their escort. In contemplating the pleasure of such a visit, Owen had lost sight of its dangers, but, alas for his happiness, they became only too quickly apparent. The ladies must be taken to the river, of course, and there the one thing above all others to see was the Varsity 8 at practice. Of the entire crew none attracted such instant attention as the stroke oar, and when they learned that he was an American their interest in him was doubled. Of course he and Mr. Owen, being compatriots in a strange land, and both having done so splendidly in the dear old university, must be friends. Oh, certainly! Then wouldn't Mr. Owen present his friend? It was always so pleasant to meet the right kind of Americans when abroad. Why, there he comes now. I am sure that must be he. Isn't it, Mr. Owen? Though one does look so different in a boat and out of it." It was indeed Peveril, who had purposely sauntered in that direction for a closer view of the pretty girl whom Dig Owen, of all men, had picked up, and in another minute Owen, with an extremely bad grace, had introduced him. From that moment, as is always the case when athletes and scholars compete for feminine favor, the scholar was almost ignored, while his muscular rival was petted to a degree that Owen declared simply scandalous. Although the latter was still allowed to act as second-best escort to the ladies, and form a fourth in their various excursions, it was always Peveril who walked, sat, strolled, and talked with Miss Rose, while Owen was monopolized by her mother. The Bonnifays had only intended to spend a day or two in Oxford, but the place proved so charmingly attractive that they remained a month, and when they finally took their departure for the Continent, Miss Rose wore a superb diamond ring on the third finger of her left hand that had very recently been placed there by Peveril. Before they separated it had been arranged that he and they should travel through Norway together during the following summer. Owen had also been invited to join the party, but had declined on the ground that immediately upon taking his degree he would be obliged to return to America. So that winter the scholar, filled with envy and bitterness, ground away gloomily but persistently at his books, while the athlete, radiant with happiness, steadily cheerful and good-natured, labored with his crew. Finally he stroked them to a win on the Thames, and then, at the height of his glory, began to consider his chances for a degree. At this moment the blow was struck, and it came in the shape of a cablegram from a New York law firm. "Return at earliest convenience. Carson dead. Affairs badly involved." Boyce Carson was the guardian whom Peveril had so seldom seen, but who had always controlled his affairs and provided so liberally for all his wants. Upon coming of age, a few months before, Peveril had sent over a power of attorney, and his ex-guardian had continued to act for him as before. They were to have had a settlement when the young man took his degree, for which purpose he had planned to run over to New York, spend a few days there, and return in time for his Norway trip with the Bonnifays. In the autumn he and they would sail for New York together, and the wedding would take place as soon thereafter as was practicable. Now this wretched cablegram promised to upset everything, and he must look forward to spending the summer in trying to disentangle an involved business, instead of spending it with the girl of his heart. Perhaps, though, badly involved did not mean so very badly, and possibly he might get through with the hated business in time for the Norway trip after all, if he only set to work at once. Of course that would necessitate the giving up of his degree, but what difference did that make? Other things were of infinitely more importance. So Peveril bade farewell to Oxford, wrote a long letter, full of love and hopeful promises, to Rose Bonnifay, at Rome, sent her a reassuring telegram from Southampton, and sailed for New York. Having been so long absent, he found very few friends in that city, and it seemed to him that some even of those few greeted him with a constraint bordering on coldness. As Boyce Carson, who had lived and died a bachelor, had roomed at the Waldorf, Peveril also established himself in that palatial caravansary, and was then ready to plunge into the business that had brought him to America. His first shock came from the lawyer who had summoned him, and who at once told him that he feared everything was lost. "I don't exactly understand what you mean," said Peveril. "In plain terms, then, I am afraid that your late guardian not only squandered his own fortune in unwise speculation, but yours as well. Perhaps this note left for you will explain the situation." Thus saying, the lawyer handed Peveril a sealed envelope addressed to him in the well-known handwriting of Boyce Carson. Tearing it open, the young man read as follows: "My dear Richard, having lost everything, including your fortune and my own honor, I have no longer an object in living. I therefore conclude that it will be best to efface myself as speedily as possible. I have made a will, leaving you my sole heir and executor. You are welcome to whatever you can save from the wreck. All papers belonging to your father and left in my charge will be handed you by Mr. Ketchum. Good-bye. Yours for the last time, Boyce Carson." "He didn't commit suicide!" exclaimed Peveril, incredulously. "It is to be feared that he did," replied the lawyer, "and the state of his affairs bears out the supposition." After this Peveril spent a month in New York, trying to recover something from the wreck of his fortune. At the end of that time he found himself with less than $100 over and above his obligations. Realizing at length that he must for the future depend entirely upon his own efforts, he made several applications for vacant positions in the city, only to find in every case that they were also sought by men more competent to fill them than he. One day, when, for want of something better to do, he was mechanically looking over a package of old papers that had belonged to his father, he came across a contract of partnership between his parent and a certain Ralph Darrell. It was for the opening and development of a mine, to be known as the Copper Princess, and located in the upper peninsula of Michigan. By the terms of the contract the partnership was to exist for 20 years, and if either party died during that time, his heir or heirs were to accept the liabilities and receive all benefits accruing to an original partner. It was, however, provided that the claims of such heirs must be made before expiration of the contract, otherwise the entire property would fall into possession of the longest surviving partner or his heirs. The document bore a date 19 years old. "Well," said Peveril, reflectively, as he finished reading this paper, "although everything else is lost, it would seem that as my father's sole heir I am still half owner in a copper mine. I wonder if it is worth looking up." Chapter 3